purpose here today is to talk about both vulnerability and viability and talk about them in a way that I can link the transition from vulnerability to viability using some of these concepts. What I'm going to try is to talk about these two concepts, but also talk about possible pathways or roads to move from vulnerability to viability. Uh, what we are seeing today, is that there is manifold increase in the levels of vulnerabilities in the small scale fishery communities around the world. Uh, Vulnerabilities that are not only material in nature, but vulnerability in all other spheres of small scale fishers' lives and livelihoods and existence. So we are kind of worried about, this increase and multidimensional increase of vulnerabilities. Um, but the question that we ask, especially in the circles of and projects that we work, we ask a critical question that if these communities were only vulnerable over a historical period of time, they would have perished by now. So they are, yes, they are vulnerable, but at the same time, there is something in them which is inherent and that keeps them going. So we call them strengths. We're saying despite being vulnerable, there are certain strengths in these communities that have helped them to survive, help them to respond to some of these emerging and existing vulnerabilities, and thereby they have continued until today. So the question is then, can we find out these trends, understand them well, and then make some strategies and build capacities in these communities and work with these communities to help them move from the vulnerability situation to more becoming viable based on these trends. So this is a kind of an approach where we work. We call it a V2B approach, which is vulnerability to viability, and the pathway to that viability could be working more and more on the strengths that are inherent in these particular systems. How do we understand vulnerability and viability? I'm going to go back to what Derek Armitage was just speaking about. So the first concept that we look at in terms of understanding vulnerability and viability is resilience. So can we look at building resilience as a way to dealing with vulnerabilities? And of course, we all know that resilience is the capacity to withstand, the capacity to respond to adversities, the capacity to respond when you are met with different levels of vulnerability. So if that is a capacity, then can we understand vulnerability and therefore viability in terms of the levels of resilience in these small scale fishing communities? So we can, in a simple term, we can say reduced levels of resilience can lead to, increasing levels of vulnerability and vice versa. Okay. The second concept that we use to understand vulnerability and viability in small scale fisheries communities is resources or capitals. Any human life anywhere in the world would require certain kinds of resources, maybe purely material resources or non-material intangible resources to survive, to make plans, to respond to adversities, to respond to different levels of vulnerabilities. So in the literature, if you look at livelihood capitals, there are many different ways to define these capitals. So people talk about human, physical, natural, social, and financial capitals, but you can divide them into more kind of material capitals or non-material capital. So social capital is something that can be relying on institutions, relationships, different levels of collaboration. So can be non-material in many ways, but at the same time, physical resources or physical capitals can be very material in nature. So the crux of the argument here is then, can we look at the levels of capitals and interaction of small scale fishers with these capitals to understand their levels of vulnerabilities, their economic status, their social position, their cultural identity, ecological security, and political voice and decision making power. All of these things would signify the level of capital and the way these people can interact to make the most out of it. The third one is well-being, which my previous speaker, Derek Armitage, has already spoken to. The beautiful thing about well-being is that it talks about a state of being of a, in this case, the small-scale fishing communities. So do people feel good? Do people feel well? And what is the state of feeling well? And this is seen in three different dimensions. One is, of course, the material. The second is the relational, and then the subjective dimensions. What this helps us to do is then to understand vulnerability in all of these three areas. So what do people have, what people can do with what they have, and how they feel about what they have and what they can do in relation to others. So these are all different dimensions of well-being that helps us to understand vulnerability or levels of vulnerability in material, relational, and subjective ways. So these are the three ways. There are many more ways, of course. So I bring these three different concepts to talk about vulnerability, and therefore less of these things in a fishing community would signify vulnerability, but more of these things might signify viability. And then this sets a kind of a momentum towards viability in communities where vulnerabilities are high in amount. Um, how do we make a transition from vulnerability to viability? So this is a busy slide. I know I'm not going to talk to each one of them. I can direct you to a recent forthcoming paper where we explain this particular transition from vulnerability to viability. What I'm trying to show on this particular slide are different approaches that have been used in literature by different scholars and have been practiced by many practitioners to understand the state of small-scale fisheries. So if I can just touch upon a few of them, so people talk about how fish is for life, which signifies that in a small-scale fishing community, people depend on fish for their life and for their livelihoods. That goes anywhere from drawing nutritional values from the fish to having an income which then sustains their family. So fish for life is an approach which helps us to understand levels of vulnerability and viability. Fisheries rhymes with poverty, which then takes us to the structural and and other aspects of fishing communities and various dynamics that then tells us that fishers are always and often identified with poverty. Is that the case always? Can we make a transition from a poverty scenario or a vulnerable scenario to a more viable kind of scenario? And then touching upon all other kinds of dominant approaches to understand and or how small scale fisheries have been explained. People talk about levels of identity, whether identity has been lost in fishing communities or not. Different kinds of encroachment and grabbing. We talk about coastal grabbing, ocean grabbing that is taking place, where fishers have lost their customary traditional fishing areas. Therefore, there is a dent on the livelihood. There is a dent on the very survival source of these fishing communities. Fishing for power, the levels of power that needs to define vulnerability and viability, and looking at fishing as a way of life. So many of these small-scale fishers that we often talk about in either vulnerable or viable situations see fishing as a way of life. Over an historical period of time, over multiple generations, these fishers have engaged in fishing only and nothing else. So fishing becomes a way of life because they engage in fishing to reflect all aspects of their life, from income to survival to engaging in the society. Everything depends on fishing being a way of life. People talk
Prateep,
about.
You have another minute.
Okay, I'll wind up. And then people talk about local knowledge or the knowledge of the fishers and its links with vulnerability and viability. fisheries being as a commons or collective action where people together act to engage in the fisheries. Of course, at the bottom of it is the struggle for survival, the fishing as a social struggle, or fishing as a movement or resistance, because there are so many adversities. So if you can see in this in particular slide, if we are losing out on each of these elements, then the small scale fishing communities become vulnerable. Is there a way to then improve and strengthen in each of these areas, restoring identity, making these struggles for power really successful, and all other aspects that have been identified on these slides can then help to transition small scale fisheries from a vulnerability situation to viable situations. Just the last slide before I end is we need to look at vulnerability and viability in the context of a change. There's massive change that is taking place, change that are systemic in nature, but change that are sudden and abrupt in nature. You can take COVID as an example of a driver that is causing innumerable amounts of change that was unexpected just few months back. So we're looking at a different kind of change, and we need to then talk about vulnerability and the transition from vulnerability to viability in small scale fisheries, in the context of these abrupt, long-term and significant changes, where the speed and intensity and the frequency of these changes and their impact has severely changed. So we need new strategies. We need new kind of collaboration at all levels to make this possible, in terms of how small scale fisheries can move from a vulnerable situation to viable situation. I will invite you to visit the V2B or Vulnerability to Viability Global Partnership website at www.v2bglobalpartnership.org if you need more information. But now I'm looking forward to your questions at the end of these presentations to engage more and answer some of your questions. Thank you very much.